Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. My name is Kevbot, and I'm so excited to finally release the first video in what I hope to be a full series, where I take an anthropological approach to understanding the history of Dungeons & Dragons, the people who created it, and the people who play it, one book at a time. In this episode, I'm going to analyze the history leading up to the creation of D&D, and how it, along with the very idea of tabletop role-playing games, evolved from collaborations and innovations within the board and miniature wargaming communities of the late 60s and early 1970s, forever changing how we play games. My focus in this episode will be on how elements from Gary Gygax's Chainmail, David Wesely's Braunstein, and David Arneson's Blackmoor all played a role in influencing what would become the original version of Dungeons & Dragons, along with fundamental elements that would shape hundreds of different role-playing games in the decades that followed. We've got a ton of information to cover today, so let's get started. What is Dungeons & Dragons? Where did it come from? Who created it and why? Most people, when asked, will say that it was created by Gary Gygax or co-created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. However, this is a bit of an oversimplification, and in reality, it involves contributions and innovations by wargamers other than Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, such as Jeff Perrin, Dave Wesely, Dave McGarry, and a whole host of others. But before we can get to that, we need to start with an extremely brief history of board and miniature wargaming. I say extremely brief because the history of board and miniature wargaming itself could easily be its own video. For now, I just want to focus on a generalized overview to lay the foundation for what needs to be known before getting into how D&D evolved from this community. It's not entirely self-evident, as while there may be some similarities between wargaming and tabletop role-playing games, they are quite different. Let's start with board wargames. A board wargame is a wargame with a set playing surface, usually comprised of a gridded map, as opposed to most board games that have a set path for tokens to follow at the roll of a die. Think more along the lines of Risk than Monopoly. Cardboard counters were usually used to represent different groupings of soldiers on a battlefield, and through a combination of strategic placement and rolling dice, these games were used to recreate famous battles of wars in the past. One of the biggest publishers of board war games was the Avalon Hill Game Company, founded in 1952 by Charles Swan Roberts II. While the first board war game published by Avalon Hill, Tactics, was a generalized battle between the sides of blue and red, the future releases from Avalon Hill, such as D-Day, Battle of the Bulge, and arguably one of their most popular releases in Gettysburg, players would take the side of the Allies or Axis, North or South, and recreate famous battles throughout history. While the community for board war games was a passionate one, it was also a small and widely dispersed one. It was a community primarily made up of teenage and college-aged kids who had an interest in history and conflict simulation. As the 60s and 1970s were the days before the internet and instant mass communication, it was extremely hard to find local players within one's community to play board war games with, outside of chance encounters within one's local bookstore, library, or university. To help galvanize the community, and also increase the sales of games within this niche hobby, gamers started publishing zines throughout the 1960s. These zines, such as The General, The Courier, and Panzerfaust, were used not only to promote new game releases from companies such as Avalon Hill, but as a way for people to publish wanted ads looking for either local gamers or gamers across the country to play by post, where they would play by mailing each other moves in a game. Along with the board wargaming community, another smaller subset of gamers began coalescing who played miniature wargames. Miniature wargames are similar to board wargames in the sense that they are also designed to recreate famous battles throughout history. However, these battles were not done with tokens on a hex board. Instead, gamers would buy and paint metal miniatures to represent groups of soldiers, and the battlefield was usually a sculptable sand table. A modern-day comparison for miniature wargames would be something along the lines of Warhammer, where combat is resolved through strategic placement and movement of miniature figures and the roll of dice. While the board wargaming community was small, the subset of miniature wargamers was even smaller. There was a much higher barrier of entry, as a single Avalon Hill game was self contained with everything needed to start playing. Miniature wargaming involved buying and painting miniatures. An Avalon Hill game could be played on a kitchen table, whereas miniature wargaming required a 6 foot by 10 foot dedicated sand table weighing around 500 pounds. And while board wargaming could be played by post, the more free spirited nature of combat movement in miniature wargaming made play by post nearly impossible. However, similar to how zines were used to bind and grow the board wargaming community, they were also indispensable for miniature wargames. They could be used to find gamers in one's local area in the classified sections, and this helped to create a rise in the formation of miniature wargaming clubs comprised of like-minded gamers who would get together to play games. This then led to gamers within the wargaming clubs writing new sets of rules for games to be used with miniature figures, freely publishing and sharing these games. The rules for miniature wargames were usually given away for free or extremely cheap by miniature manufacturers to incentivize people to buy the miniatures themselves, as that is where the money was. In this regard, the rules for miniature wargames were seen as about as valuable as the packaging for the product. One of the results of this was fostering within the community a sense of openness, and this in turn led to freedom of collaboration, publication, and innovation of rules to be used with miniature wargames. Gamers would publish rules in zines, which would be played by other gamers in clubs, and those rules would then be refined through the introduction of house rules and republished to further create variations and entirely new games for people to play. The wargaming community was a small one not based on commodity and profit as much as innovation through collaboration. The original designers of Dungeons and Dragons were participants in these broader communities in wargaming, and the game owes much of its shape to the influences that surrounded them. One of the most prolific contributing members in this community, due to his high degree of collaboration and innovation, was a man named Gary Gygax. Born July 27th, 1938, in Chicago, Illinois, Ernest Gary Gygax was a prominent member of the Midwest wargaming community. Although he was born and for a short time worked in Chicago, he grew up and raised his family in the small town of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Gary first got into board wargaming through the Avalon Hill game Gettysburg, and would soon become one of the most prolific members of the board and miniature wargaming communities. He would dedicate not only his free time and resources, but also his time and resources from his job as an insurance underwriter towards playing games, forming wargaming clubs, publishing articles in club zines, and collaborating on rule sets for wargames. One of the longest lasting legacies of these collaborative efforts is the Geneva Convention, or Gen Con, which was started by Gary Gygax in 1968. Initially hosted at the Horticultural Hall in Lake Geneva, just a block away from his home, the convention has grown and been held every year since. Gygax had a tremendous creative energy and could not stop himself from writing and publishing, often getting his name within a title as a co-writer or contributing editor, and his name can be found all over the publications from within the wargaming communities throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. He was always open to teach others about the games he was working on, or learn about games that others were creating and would bring to him. Gygax had a genius-level creative understanding for what games were fun to play, and more importantly, he knew how to make them even better. He was the ultimate collaborator. While most board and miniature war games took place during the battles of the Great Wars of the 20th century, American Civil War, or Napoleonic period, Gary had a fascination with the medieval period. He wanted to design and play historical miniature war games with Elastolan figures set in the Middle Ages. To help facilitate this, he founded the Castle and Crusade Society, a wargaming club with a focus on medieval miniature wargaming. The Castle and Crusade Society, like other wargaming clubs, published a zine called the Domesday Book. A fellow wargamer and member of Gygax's Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association wargaming club named Jeff Perrin wrote a 4-page set of rules for the medieval period called Geneva Medieval Miniatures that was initially published in the Panzerfaust zine in April of 1970. Gygax believed that he could help to collaborate on and expand this set of rules. The two of them would work together to expand and publish the rules again in the Castle and Crusade Society zine Domesday Book 5, but this time under the name Chainmail. Gary Gygax continued to work with Jeff Perrin on expanding the rules for Chainmail, and the two of them went on to have the rules officially published by Don Lowry's newest business venture called Guidon Games. Gygax explained that Chainmail would contain revised medieval rules, building on those published earlier in the Domesday Book, but also promised that wizards, dragons, and all that good stuff are included as well. These rules would be found in the fantasy supplement in the back of Chainmail, specifically written and included by Gygax to allow wargamers to refight the epic struggles related to J.R.R. Tolkien, Robert E. Howard, and other fantasy writers. Or you can devise your own world and conduct fantastic campaigns and conflicts based on it. Gygax would stage his own fantastic battles in a campaign setting that he created, the Great Kingdom of the Castle and Crusade Society. Gary's desire to play games set in a medieval fantasy world was likely influenced by his early life, where he would hear heroic fantasy stories told to him as a child by his parents. Gygax was also an aspiring fantasy novelist, not only writing fantasy fiction during a brief time of unemployment after being laid off from Fireman Fund's insurance, he also published a few articles on the taxonomy of different colored dragons in 1969 that informed how Chainmail, and later on Dungeons and Dragons, would represent them. His fantasy rules owed a significant debt to the prior work of adapting Tolkien for wargaming, circulated by New England gamer Leonard Patt. And Pat's work was merely the most recent addition in a long line of wargames inspired by fantasy fiction, building on the works of innovators such as Tony Bath. True to the spirit of innovation and collaboration, Gygax refined and expanded Pat's existing rules into Chainmail and its fantasy supplement, through his own personal interest in the subject matter and experience as a miniature wargamer. One of the main reasons why Chainmail was eventually published by Don Lowry's Guidon Games was due to Gygax being hired by Guidon Games to develop their Wargaming with Miniatures series of games. This collaboration of Lowry and Gygax again helped to lead innovation that would push wargaming into new territory. Avalon Hill and SPI exclusively published historical combat simulations, and no one sold rules for fantasy wargames at the time. So why attach these fantasy rules to Chainmail? Gygax believed that most of the fantastic battles related in novels more closely resembled medieval warfare than they do earlier or later forms of combat. Fantasy fiction occupied its own countercultural niche in the American popular culture at the time. The sudden popularity of Tolkien in the mid-1960s, after the American paperback editions of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings were published, also caused reprints and sales of many other fantasy authors, such as Robert E. Howard's Conan the Cimmerian. Chainmail also makes reference to authors Poul Anderson and Michael Moorcock, both noted writers of fantasy fiction in the 1960s, and clear influences on Gygax's love for fantasy. Chainmail, and specifically its fantasy supplement, marked a controversial step because wargamers in general considered their hobby to be a serious adult and intellectual pastime of realistically recreating battles throughout history. The idea of enacting fantasy battles, especially from the perspective of the older wargamers, seemed childish and tainted this carefully cultivated image of wargaming as an academic hobby. Even the way Guidon Games promoted Chainmail came across as mildly apologetic and defensive. The first advertisement focused on the strength of the medieval rules and only briefly mentions the fantasy rules at the end. Special features include rules for jousting and hand-to-hand combat in a large fantasy supplement for gaming with superheroes, wizards, trolls, hobbits, and, why not, dragons, among others. Justification for this defensiveness is not difficult to find. In the November 1969 Wargamers newsletter, Don Featherstone wrote, "No one resisted more strongly than I when an opponent introduced into his ancient wargames the use of wizards whose spells would turn cavalry squadrons into toads." Although there was controversy regarding the fantasy supplement, especially among the older gamers, opinion on the matter was not unanimous. Younger gamers, many of who played with Gygax in the Midwest wargaming community, such as brothers Rob and Terry Kuntz, found it quite engaging. The International Wargamer carried the lone positive review, praising the fantasy supplement by Leonard Lofka. The fantasy supplement, using hobbits, elves, orcs, superheroes, wizards, and dragons, plus many more, is utterly delightful. Gygax believes that the fantasy rules were proved the most popular element of the game, and cited anecdotal evidence of Chainmail's favorable reception by the wargaming community.
We get people who are interested in fantasy and like to get into fantasy wargaming, and there seems to be a growing interest in history.
Whether because of or in spite of the divisiveness and controversy of the fantasy supplement, Chainmail sold well. It took hold in a number of wargaming communities around the American Midwest. Gygax would say, Chainmail is doing quite well, as almost everyone wants to play the fantasy game. Its fantasy supplement had connected with a group of interested gamers who wargame publishers had previously neglected. Fans of Tolkien, Howard, and other authors whose epic fantasy battles Chainmail could enable gamers to recreate. The rules effectively opened a new market for guide-on games. However, it was an untested one, which made it hard to predict how big or small it might be. The publication of Chainmail in 1971 marked the culmination of Perrin and Gygax's work on the medieval combat system. So what exactly was published in the fantasy supplement? As previously mentioned, it contains game rules for familiar Tolkien creatures, Conan, Elric, and Anderson's novel Three Hearts and Three Lions. The influence of Moorcock is perhaps most noted, where creatures are sorted into factions of law, neutral, and chaos, which would lay the foundation for the alignment system in Dungeons and Dragons, found in every edition of the game since. Other elements found in Chainmail that would be foundational in shaping the game of Dungeons and Dragons include the man-to-man combat rules to adjudicate melee combat between individual combatants, as opposed to mass combat rules, spells such as Cloud Kill, Phantasmal Force, and Polymorph, the Bestiary, containing creatures such as dragons, elementals, and trolls, magic items such as enchanted arrows and magic swords, the Jousting Matrix, and fantasy conditions such as invisibility, regeneration, and shapeshifting. Whether because of or in spite of its fantasy supplement, Chainmail sold enough copies to establish the viability of the Guide-On Games Wargaming and Miniatures line. For Don Lowry, this became another facet of a quickly growing wargaming media business. For Gygax, it would become a way for him to further cooperate on game design with more wargamers. If we're to call Dungeons and Dragons a fantasy role-playing game, Chainmail helps us to understand where the fantasy and game parts of that title come from, with its game rules in the fantasy supplement. However, anyone who has read the rules of Chainmail will notice that it's far from what we might consider a role-playing game. And for that aspect, we need to briefly switch away from the Lake Geneva wargamers to see what innovations were concurrently happening within the Twin Cities wargaming communities, one state over. While Gygax was primarily playing and collaborating with wargamers in the Midwest region of Lake Geneva and Chicago, innovations in wargaming were concurrently happening within the Twin Cities wargaming groups of Minneapolis, St. Paul, that would come to be equally influential in the creation of Dungeons and Dragons and the shift towards developing tabletop role-playing games. Born in 1945, David Wesely studied physics at Hamline University in St. Paul, Minnesota, and was a prominent contributor who brought several innovative ideas to the Twin Cities wargaming groups. Wesely was an avid reader of wargaming literature, and in 1967 found inspiration in a book at the University of Minnesota Library, Charles Totten's Strategos, The American Art of War, 1880. Wesely adapted many of the rules and gaming philosophies found in Strategos into the miniature war games played by the Midwest Military Simulation Association, MMSA, Wargaming Club. Like Gygax adapting the works of Pat and Bath into Chainmail, Wesely adapted these gaming philosophies into a new game called Strategos N, published in 1968. One of the major philosophies adopted from Strategos was the role of the referee and the principle from Free Kriegspiel that players could attempt to do anything, although not always successfully, and that the referee should be able to make judgments to adjudicate anything not ordinarily covered by the rules. Taught in Strategos became an influential text for the Twin Cities gamers. It is among the earliest published American wargaming rules, based on the Prussian wargame Kriegspiel. Beyond detailed instructions for movement and dice-based combat resolutions, Strategos borrows from Kriegspiel the idea of an authoritative referee responsible for determining the course of events during the game. It rejects strict adherence to predetermined rules in favor of allowing freedom to the referee and players in determining which tactics might be employed and how successful they might be. As Totten would put it, the office of referee should be regarded not so much in the light of an advisor as of an arbiter. He should bear in mind the principle that anything can be attempted. The referee, therefore, should generally require a positive statement of intention as the basis of his decision. The attempt must be willed into operation by the player. Here we see what I believe to be the most innovative idea, foundational to the concept of all role-playing games, and the element that makes them unique compared to any other type of game. The idea that anything can be attempted. When the referee asks the players, "What do you want to do?" gaming for the first time is pushed into virgin territory. Anything that words can describe can become a component of the game, which separates it from boards, miniatures, and anything but the shared imagination of the referee and the players. The success of this type of game depends on the strength of the referee, as Totten acknowledges. The skillful exercise of the important office of referee requires not only a special aptitude, but it is indispensable that he, of all others, should be so thoroughly familiar with the principles and methods of the game. However, if literally anything can be attempted in a game, it would be impossible to design a system that provided for every situation and outcome. Therefore, the mechanics designed by Totten, and later games influenced by him, defer to the wisdom of the referee. These rules, being suggestive, not binding, leaving him free in the exercise of his judgment, as enlightened by his own experience and study. In later videos, we will see how this deference to the referee and loose rule structure creates problems for early editions of Dungeons & Dragons when organized play is attempted, as well as how designers go about addressing the issue. Dave Wesely grasped the liberating potential of this approach for wargamers, especially in comparison to the stringency of following rules laid out in games published by companies like Avalon Hill. Wesely embraced Totten's playstyle and philosophy towards gaming predicated on open-endedness, the core belief that a player might attempt any action, that a referee must determine the results and consequences, and that any predetermined system can only serve to inspire, not constrain, that outcome. Wesely spread these ideas throughout the Twin Cities wargaming clubs, such as the Midwest Military Simulation Association, and they spread through much of the area's subsequent miniature wargaming groups. Eventually, these core beliefs will become foundational to the game Dungeons & Dragons, and will remain mostly unchanged for the next 50 years of tabletop role-playing games. Under the influence of Totten's Strategos, Wesely ran a series of storytelling miniature wargames that shifted from controlling mass armies to instead everyone taking on an individual role of a character in a given situation. Due to the size and amount of players in these games, some characters were not even soldiers and had objectives and victory conditions aside from military ones. On the premise that anything might be attempted, anything might be achieved. Therefore, military supremacy wasn't the only victory condition in these games. Wesely's rules were something new to the players, who were used to war games that relied on strict rules, guidelines, and win conditions. Instead, now just given a character with goals and expected to engage in free-form discussions with other characters. These experimentations culminated in Wesely's 1969 Napoleonic miniature game set in a fictitious German town of Braunstein on the eve of a French invasion. Allowing characters in the game the same freedom that a real person would have engages the imagination of players in a different way than traditional wargames, where the rules system restricts actions of players to a narrow set of allowable moves. The players would tell the referee, Dave Wesely, what they wanted the character to do, and he would explain the result. This was the logical consequence of the notion that anything can be attempted, and opened up a new dimension of gaming, inhabiting a character. These games became very popular and influential locally, and became known in the Twin Cities area as a Braunstein, to refer to any game with a referee that adjudicated the actions of individual characters with diverse victory conditions based on point-scoring systems. This name would encompass any game of this type, even if it wasn't set in the fictional town of Braunstein, which many successors weren't. Some of these other games include being set in the fictional town of Brownstone in the Old West and refereed by Dwayne Jenkins, a banana republic known as Banania, and notably, Dave Arneson's game, the fantasy genre setting of Blackmoor. David L. Arneson was born October 1st, 1947 in Hennepin County, Minnesota, and studied history at the University of Minnesota with a keen interest in the Napoleonic era. Arneson belonged to his university's wargaming club and edited the club's newsletter. Like Gygax, other wargamers in his area would regularly come to play games in his basement, and so he decided to run a medieval fantasy Braunstein set in the realm of his creation called Blackmoor. Also like Gygax, Arneson found inspiration in the writings of Robert E. Howard's Conan stories set in the sword and sorcery genre, John Norman's gore novels, and in classic B movies shown on a local television station's creature feature. Arneson wrote in Volume 3 of The Corner of the Table, there will be a medieval Braunstein, April 17th, 1971, at the home of Dave Arneson from 1 o'clock to midnight, with refreshments being available on the usual basis. It will feature mythical creatures and a poker game under the Troll's Bridge between sunup and sundown. One of Arneson's innovations to Blackmoor, in comparison to Braunstein, that would also carry over into Dungeons & Dragons, was a collaborative element between the players. In Braunstein, everyone is playing as an individual character with individual goals. In Blackmoor, everyone is still playing as an individual character, however they are all collectively working together as a group. The success of the first Blackmoor game meant that Arneson would run it again, and returning players resumed the same roles that they had before. This led to the second innovation from Arneson, adapted from Dwayne Jenkins' Brownstone. Whereas Wesely's Braunstein games were self-contained in a single session, Blackmoor was a true campaign game, in which the results of a previous session set the stage for the next session, and this allowed the individual characters to grow and change over time. Characters could acquire magic weapons and retain them from session to session. There's no winning or losing in the traditional sense, since the game's reality is a living world, with play stopping at the end of one game session and then resuming in the exact same place in the next. Arneson would publish these Blackmoor's Battle Reports, detailing each session and the perils of living in medieval Europe, in the Corner of the Table and Domesday Book, for other gamers subscribed to the zines to read. During his Blackmoor games, conflict arose between Arneson as the referee and the players at the table on the rules for combat, and they decided they needed to clarify and codify the combat rules. To do so, Arneson grabbed his copy of Chainmail with its charts for fantasy and man-to-man combat and used them to help adjudicate the combat portion of his Blackmoor games. Arneson had met Gygax a few years earlier at Gen Con 2, and the two of them were in frequent correspondence, with Arneson even writing to Gygax about Strategos as early as 1970. Arneson was one of the first members of Gary Gygax's Castle and Crusade Society wargaming group, and the two of them had even started collaborating on rules for miniature wargames set in the Napoleonic era. Here, continuing the spirit of innovation and collaboration, Dave Arneson merges the fantasy combat rules from Gary Gygax's Chainmail with the players as individual character idea from David Wesely's Braunstein into his fantasy setting and game of Blackmoor. Even though Arneson himself didn't refer to these games as fantasy role-playing, but instead called them adventure games, in my opinion, it is at this point where the accumulation of years of innovation, experimentation, and collaboration between dozens of wargamers officially develops into the first tabletop fantasy role-playing game. Maybe it was something about the fantasy setting itself that contributed to the idea that the imagination should not yield to the constraints of boards and systems. The end results forged a truly fantastic medieval wargame campaign. As these gamers embraced the principle that anything can be attempted, their play increasingly diverged from wargaming and tended towards something else. The Blackmoor campaign contained elements that would come to shape all kinds of games in the future, not just tabletop role-playing games, but also formats such as video games. As characters got gold and defeated monsters, they would grow in power. Previous Braunstein-style games involved the concept of accumulating victory points, but the points scored in Blackmoor for acquiring gold and killing monsters became experience points. As Arneson writes, further tables and charts were then made to take into account player progress and experience. With these charts, each player increases their ability in a given area by engaging in activity in that area. For a fighter, this meant that by killing opponents, normal types or monsters, their ability to strike an opponent and avoid the latter's blows was increased. This measured the character's experience, and when a high enough total was reached, the characters would advance in level. The second revolutionary innovation introduced in Blackmoor was the idea that the dungeons beneath Castle Blackmoor were a place where heroes went looking for adventure and treasure. Arneson mapped dungeon levels beneath the castle, with each level containing progressively stronger monsters. It began with only the basic monsters in Chainmail, and was only some 6 levels deep. 6 levels was chosen since it allowed a random placement with a 6-sided die. Arneson would keep his players in the dark while they explored his dungeon, giving them information only about their immediate surroundings and leaving it to their ingenuity to navigate through the dungeon. This solidified Blackmoor as a 2-mode game, with the mode of exploration negotiated verbally with the referee as inspired by Braunstein, which transitions into a mode of combat where monsters are encountered and adjudicated with rules from Chainmail. The third revolutionary idea introduced in Blackmoor, this time inspired by another game published by Avalon Hill called Outdoor Survival, was the inclusion of overland travel over a hex grid for above-ground adventures. Avalon Hill published the game Outdoor Survival in September 1972, and it incorporates a wilderness encounter system. When a player enters an unexplored hex, a die is rolled to determine if a beneficial or harmful event occurs. As Arneson explains, the wilderness encounter aspect was modified to mean that you met various creatures, which you then have to hack your way through. Arneson adopted these original random encounter tables, which would become the first wandering monsters, into an encounter matrix, a table of random monsters that could be found in each of the 6 types of environments present in Outdoor Survival. The fantasy creatures that populated the encounter matrix were effectively the same as those included in Chainmail. Finally, Outdoor Survival also has a life level index that grants players 15 points of thirst and hunger damage they can withstand, based on tracking a water index and food index. As Arneson would also write, there's also the chance that you will die of thirst or hunger, how ignoble, while wandering around lost. This life level index may have been the early influence for Arneson's idea of hit points, also introduced in Blackmoor, as Arneson had begun to alter the combat system of Chainmail to allow for creatures taking variable hit points of damage before dying. Part of this was done due to players in Arneson's Blackmoor campaign finding it unsatisfying when their characters would die after a single hit from a monster. Throughout 1972, Gygax had read Arneson's reports on Blackmoor in Corner of the Table, Domesday Book, as well as personal correspondence with Arneson. In December, Gygax wrote a postcard to Arneson asking, "Can you send me your group's modifications and additions to Chainmail for Blackmoor?" Gygax was planning on printing a 3rd edition of Chainmail in a few months, and wanted to include what he believed were Arneson's modifications to the game. "We'll use some in 3rd edition next year. We'll give you credit and free set of rules. Please advise." From this, it can be inferred that Gygax did not fully understand what the Twin Cities gamers were doing with his Chainmail rules. Gygax thought that they were altering the rules themselves, a common practice in wargaming at the time. But in reality, they were simply including the rules in an entirely new game of Blackmoor that had combined Wesely's Braunstein referee-based roleplay with the fantasy combat rules from Chainmail. Therefore, as far as modifications to Chainmail itself is concerned, Arneson truly didn't have much to send to Gygax, outside of a couple small modifications. Arneson wrote back to Gygax. As to Chainmail modifications, they were fairly minor, and the big change was laying out the dungeon for exploration and the like, combined with a maze which you have to map as you go along, thus offering the possibility of getting lost. Arneson stressed the importance of the referee within his game, that made it something fundamentally different from a wargame system. It's the imagination of the ref that adds the real spice. Regardless, Arneson was happy to share his modifications to Chainmail with Gygax, and sent him some charts and notes from his Blackmoor campaign at the start of 1973. Years later, Gygax would dismissively refer to these 20 or so pages of handwritten rules while trying in bad faith to minimize Arneson's contribution to the creation of Dungeons & Dragons. Of course, this bad faith argument is predicated on the idea that Arneson's only contribution to the creation of Dungeons & Dragons were these alterations to Chainmail from his home campaign, notes that Arneson had no intention on ever publishing in a formal game system. In reality, this was actually probably the least important of Arneson's contributions to Dungeons & Dragons, as we explored earlier. However, that is a topic that will be discussed again in a video much later in the series. After Gygax expressed some interest, Arneson decided to drive down to Lake Geneva to run Blackmoor for Gygax and his friends in February of 1973. Arneson offered to bring along Dave McGarry, who, like Dave Wesely and Dave Arneson, was a member of the Twin Cities Wargaming group Midwest Military Simulation Association. Dave McGarry designed and created Dungeon, or as it was initially called, the Dungeons of Pashakata, to try and condense Blackmoor into a traditional board game as a way to relieve the referee duties of Dave Arneson and allow him to play as a character as well. The game isolated and simplified the dungeon exploration mode of Blackmoor, with traditional win conditions of a standard board game that were inspired from Blackmoor, namely looting gold from treasure hoards, defended by random monsters selected from a deck of cards. Stronger monsters and larger treasure hoards would be found in the deeper levels of the dungeon, again similar to the Blackmoor campaign structure. As the rulebook read, the deeper you go, the better they are, but the worse it gets. The first character to reach a given amount of gold, which was different for each of the 4 character types, would win. Gygax had heard from Arneson about McGarry's Dungeons of Pashakata, which Guidon Games might want to evaluate for purchase, as Parker Brothers had already rejected publishing it. So Dave Arneson suggested that the two of them drive to Lake Geneva to show both Blackmoor and the Dungeons of Pashakata to Gary Gygax. During the visit, Arneson ran Gygax, McGarry, and some of the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association members through a Blackmoor adventure. Gygax found that experience, and McGarry's dungeon board game, tremendously inspiring, and the enthralling game of Blackmoor ended in the early hours of the morning. 2 things in particular captured Gygax's imagination: the idea of measured progression and the addition of games taking place in the dungeon maze. He was also struck by the manner in which Arneson had expanded character descriptions, the availability of diverse equipment that characters could purchase, and the addition of new monsters. This was the night that all of the experimentation, collaboration, and innovation had reached a tipping point that would change history and their lives forever. Once Arneson shared with Gygax the playstyle developed for Blackmoor, the path to publication of the Rules for Fantastic Medieval Wargame Campaigns, known as Dungeons and Dragons, had begun. Gygax was hooked, and, always being one to cooperate on game design, he went to work. Thank you so much for watching the first episode of my series on the history of Dungeons & Dragons, the people who created it, and the people who play it, one book at a time. What do you think about the story of how collaboration and innovation within the wargaming community, from Gary Gygax's Chainmail, Dave Wesely's Braunstein, and Dave Arneson's Blackmoor, played a role in influencing what would become Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games in the decades to come? Let me know in those comments down below. In the next episode, we'll take a look at the drafting and printing of the rules for the original Dungeons & Dragons, as well as the formation of the company Tactical Studies Rules, or TSR, that would publish it. Thank you again for watching. My name is Kevbot, and I will see you in the next video.